A tiny German Shepherd puppy whimpered at a sealed bank envelope no one feared. Inside was an old widow's stolen name. By nightfall, Jessica Ward found 6 more seniors marked like targets behind fake IDs, gift cards, and a beloved charity. Then Rin smelled something hidden under an apple pie box. And the next name to vanish was standing right there. If you believe God still sends help to the forgotten, leave amen. 12 days after I carried Rin out of that cold, forgotten place, I still woke before sunrise just to make sure he was breathing. He was no bigger than a rolled hand towel then, a 3.5-week-old sable German Shepherd puppy with a dark little muzzle, soft folded ears, and paws too large for the rest of him, as if heaven had already measured him for a future he had not yet grown into. His eyes had only begun to open, cloudy and uncertain, but his nose worked like a tiny compass. I had sat across from men who lied without blinking. I had read case files that seemed to leave frost on the soul. Yet nothing had ever frightened me more than the quiet space between Rin's breaths. I was not officially back in the field. That mattered. My supervisor had told me to rest, and for once I had not argued. I brought Rin to Maple Hollow, Vermont, because the town had belonged to my mother's sister years ago, and because there were places in America where the morning still arrived gently. Maple Hollow sat between a blue lake and a shoulder of green hills, with white clapboard houses, red barns, a small church steeple, and old maple trees that leaned over the streets like watchful grandparents. At 8 in the morning, the bakery smelled of cinnamon. At noon, the hardware store bell rang every time someone pushed through the door. By evening, the older men sat outside the diner and discussed weather with the seriousness of Congress. I told myself Rin needed quiet. The truth was, I did too. My kitchen became half recovery room, half command post. On the table sat a wool-lined basket where Rin slept curled like a comma. Beside it, I placed an old brass clock, because someone once told me orphaned puppies found comfort in steady ticking. On the refrigerator, yellow notes reminded me when to warm his milk, when to change his cloth, when to call Dr. Lillian Price if he refused a feeding. Doctor. Price was Maple Hollow's veterinarian, a silver-haired woman in her early 60s with weathered hands, kind brown eyes, and the no-nonsense voice of someone who had delivered calves during snowstorms and comforted old dogs on their final afternoons. She had inspected Rin, tapped my wrist with a pen, and said, "Agent Ward, you may understand federal procedure, but this little fellow now outranks you." She was right. Rin ruled my house with the authority of a sleeping acorn. He whimpered if the milk was half a degree too cool. He sneezed at dust. He tried to crawl toward my old FBI jacket whenever I left it near the chair, pressing his nose into the sleeve as if my scent were a map back to safety. I had worn that jacket through winter roads, long interviews, and more lonely hotel rooms than I cared to count. To Rin, it was not a badge. It was home. That morning, sunlight lay across the kitchen floor in pale gold squares. Rin was asleep in his basket, one paw twitching against the wool. I was rinsing a bottle at the sink when someone knocked on the back door. Not hard, but with the careful rhythm of a person raised to believe even bad news should be polite. When I opened it, Eleanor Whitaker stood on the porch, holding a white envelope in both hands. Eleanor was 74, tall in the way older Vermont women often are, slightly stooped, but still rooted like a birch that had survived many winters. Her hair was silver and pinned in a soft knot at the back of her head. Her skin had the fine, sun-touched lines of a woman who loved her garden more than mirrors. She usually wore pale blue sweaters, canvas shoes, and floral gloves tucked into one pocket. She had lost her husband, Arthur, 8 years earlier, and since then she lived next door with Moses, an elderly orange cat with one cloudy eye, a grand opinion of himself, and a habit of sitting on windowsills as though judging the moral condition of the street. "I am sorry to bother you, Jessica," Eleanor said, though her voice had already begun to tremble. "I think the bank has made a mistake." People often say mistake when their heart already knows another word. I brought her inside and made tea because tea gives frightened hands something warm to hold. Eleanor sat at my kitchen table, back straight, envelope flat before her like a summons. Ryn stirred but did not wake. She explained that the notice had come from her store card account connected to North Star Supply, the large hardware store on the North Road. According to the statement, she had purchased a portable generator, 2 tool batteries, and a set of outdoor lights for a little over $900. The account had been verified with her personal information. The purchase had gone through smoothly. "I have not been to North Star in months," she whispered. "Arthur handled tools. I only go there for birdseed." I examined the notice first, then the envelope. At a glance it looked ordinary. Bank logo, printed address, postal markings. But the flap bothered me. The seal had been opened and pressed shut again with unusual care. Too much care. Real mail carried small scars from the world. Bent corners, uneven glue, a tired crease. This envelope looked as if someone had tried to return it to innocence. I lifted it closer. There was a faint smell at the edge of the flap, not strong enough for most people to name. Warm plastic, bitter paper, something like heated ink. A tiny sound broke the room. Not a bark, not a cry, but a thin, startled whimper from the basket. Ryn's nose rose above the wool, trembling toward the envelope. The brass clock kept ticking. Eleanor stopped breathing for half a second, and the quiet kitchen suddenly felt as if a hidden door had opened somewhere inside the morning. I moved the envelope away. Ryn settled. I brought it back near his blanket. His head turned again, slow and uncertain, and his little dark nose pressed toward the glued edge. He did not know what a store card was. He did not know about false identification, stolen names, or the soft ways people can be robbed without a hand ever touching their pocket. He only knew that something in that paper did not belong. Eleanor looked from Ryn to me. "Is he all right?" "He is," I said, though my eyes stayed on the envelope. "But I am not sure this paper is." I asked Eleanor whether her mail had been late recently. She frowned, thinking. Then she nodded. A bank notice had arrived 4 days late. A health insurance letter had come, already opened, at one corner. A replacement card she expected never appeared at all. Each detail was small enough to dismiss alone. Together, they began to form a shape. I was supposed to be resting. Ryn was supposed to be healing. Maple Hollow was supposed to be a quiet town where old cats guarded windows and neighbors brought jam in clean glass jars. But I had learned long ago that trouble rarely announces itself with thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a white envelope, resealed too neatly, carried in the shaking hands of a woman who still believes the world should be honest. That afternoon, after Eleanor went home, I photographed the envelope, the statement, and the flap under the kitchen light. I made one call to a friend in financial crimes asking for an unofficial look at recent North Star Supply store card activity near Maple Hollow. Then I fed Ryn, wrapped him in the blue cloth Eleanor had once knitted for a grandchild now grown, and watched him sleep beside the brass clock. Night came softly over Vermont. The lake darkened. The maples outside my window turned black against a violet sky. For 1 hour, I almost believed the matter might still be small. Then my phone rang. I answered with Ryn sleeping in the basket beside my hand. My friend did not waste words. Eleanor Whitaker was not the only one. 6 other elderly residents within 30 miles of Maple Hollow had opened, used, or been charged through store card accounts in the same strange pattern. I looked at Ryn. His tiny paw rested against the wool, and his nose twitched once in his sleep. The old clock ticked on, and just like that, rest was over. By morning, Eleanor's envelope no longer felt like a mistake. It sat inside a clean evidence sleeve on my kitchen table, looking too harmless for the trouble it had invited into Maple Hollow. Ryn slept beside it in his wool basket, wrapped in the blue cloth Eleanor had knitted years ago for a grandchild who now lived somewhere in Oregon and called on Sundays when the weather behaved. The brass clock ticked near his head, and every few seconds his little sable nose twitched, as if some tiny dream had passed by carrying a scent only he could understand. I did not call it a case yet. I was careful about that. I was still supposed to be resting, still feeding Rin every few hours, still waking at night with one hand hovering over his ribs to feel that thin, faithful rise and fall. But 6 more elderly residents had the same strange pattern tied to their names, and rest began to feel less like healing and more like turning my face away. So I called my supervisor, Assistant Special Agent in Charge Martin Keene, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with close-cropped gray hair, a square jaw, and a voice that always sounded as if it had been sanded down by hard decisions. Keene had spent most of his career in financial crimes, and a long-ago pension fraud case involving his own father had made him especially sharp when older victims were involved. He listened without interrupting, then gave me a narrow path. I could assist as a temporary consultant, document what I found, and coordinate with the right agencies if the pattern widened. "You are not back in the field ward," he said. "You are observing." I looked at Rin, who had managed to roll halfway out of his blanket like a heroic little potato. "Understood," I said, which was not quite the same as agreement. North Star Supply stood on the North Road where Maple Hollow thinned into pines and repair shops. It was a big, practical store with orange carts, stacks of lumber, bags of soil, and a bell that gave a tired ring every time the automatic doors opened. Inside, the air smelled of fresh-cut wood, paint, metal screws, and burnt coffee from a pot near the customer service desk. Sunlight came through the high front windows and settled on rows of power tools like a polite blessing on things that could still be fixed. I left Rin in the warm car for only a few minutes, with Eleanor watching him from the passenger seat. She had insisted, arriving with a thermos of tea, 2 blankets, and Moses's disapproving orange hair clinging to her sleeve. "He is too small for fluorescent lights and loud carts," she told me, "and frankly, so am I before 10 o'clock. Rin seemed content. He tucked his nose into my old FBI jacket, gave one soft sigh, and surrendered to sleep. The manager of North Star Supply was Dale Mercer. He was 52, broad through the chest, with a thick brown mustache gone silver at the edges, tired blue eyes, and hands rough from a lifetime of lifting lumber even after he moved into management. He wore a brown plaid shirt under a faded store vest, and he had the look of a man who knew every hinge, bolt, and widow in town. People greeted him by name. He greeted them back with a smile that worked hard but did not quite reach his eyes. Dale took me to a small office behind the returns counter. The room was crowded with filing boxes, old calendars, and a framed photograph of a younger Dale standing beside a teenage boy with the same square chin. He did not ask why the FBI cared about store charges in a quiet Vermont town. That was the first thing I noticed. Innocent people usually ask one too many questions. Worried people often ask none at all. He showed me the transaction records. The pattern was simple enough to hide in plain sight. A customer came in, filled a cart with items under a certain amount, and said the same thing at checkout. "I forgot my store card." Then came the personal information: name, address, date of birth, last digits of a Social Security number. The system found the account. If the cashier asked for identification, the customer presented an ID with his own photograph but someone else's details printed beneath it. A clerk, pressed by lines, lights, and the small panic of retail work, saw a green approval screen and let the sale pass. "They always bought practical things," Dale said, rubbing one hand over his mustache. "Generators, tool batteries, work lights, sometimes gift cards. Nothing flashy. Nothing that made the kids at the register nervous." "Gift cards should have made them nervous," I said. Dale looked down. "It should have made me nervous, too." There it was, a crack in the floorboards of his voice. Not guilt, not yet, but strain. I wrote it down in my mind and kept going. One transaction stopped me cold. Harold Bell, 82 years old, charged for a compact generator, a cordless drill set, and 3 gift cards just after 8:40 in the evening. The receipt said the purchase was verified in person. Dale recognized the name immediately. Harold? No, that cannot be right. He fixes clocks at the care home, or he used to. His legs are not what they were. Half an hour later, I was at Maple Haven Residence, a small elder care home with white shutters, hydrangeas by the walkway, and a lobby that smelled of lemon polish and chicken soup. I brought Rin this time, tucked safely in his lined basket, because the building was quiet, warm, and Dr. Price had approved short visits if I kept him covered. Harold Bell sat near a sunlit window, a thin man with milk-white hair combed neatly back, pale skin, and long fingers that still seemed shaped for delicate work. He wore a cream cardigan over a pressed shirt, and on his lap rested a silver pocket watch on a worn chain. His face had the gentle dignity of someone who had lost much but refused to become bitter. When I asked about North Star, he looked embarrassed before he looked afraid. That hurt more. Older victims often apologize for being deceived, as if trust were a flaw instead of proof that they had lived decently. "I have not been to North Star since last spring," Harold said. "My knees complain if I cross the room too fast." Then Rin hiccuped from inside the basket, a tiny, indignant sound that made Harold blink. A smile touched his mouth, small but real. "Well now," he whispered, "that officer needs oiling." "He is not an officer yet," I said, "more of a recruit with milk breath." Harold chuckled, and for a moment the room softened. He reached out one careful hand. Rin, still half asleep, pushed his dark nose into Harold's palm and went still, as if the old man's skin carried the same tired tenderness as the blankets that kept him alive. Harold's eyes shone. "My wife would have loved him," he said. "She believed dogs could hear the parts of us we never managed to say." Then he opened the pocket watch. Inside the lid was a tiny folded paper with a bank phone number written in blue-gray ink. Rin's nose lifted. His body stiffened just enough for me to notice. The watch gave a small metallic click, bright and sharp in the quiet room, and Rin answered with a thin whimper. Harold froze, the silver lid trembling in his hand. For one breath, sunlight flashed across the old watch glass, and the room seemed to hold still around a sorrow none of us had named yet. I asked to see the paper. Harold handed it over, confused. The ink had smeared at one corner, the same blue-gray shade I had seen near the flap of Eleanor's envelope. I did not tell Harold that. Not yet. I only asked where the number came from. He said a volunteer had written it down during a senior safety session weeks earlier, after telling him it was wise to keep bank contact information close. Harold looked at the receipt copy I had brought, then at his watch, then at me. "Agent Ward," he said softly, "I am not only worried about the money. If someone can use my name to buy a drill, what else can they make my name do?" I had no comforting answer. Some questions are not asking for comfort. They are asking whether the world still has a door strong enough to keep wrong things outside. That evening, back in my kitchen, Rin slept under Eleanor's blue cloth, while I spread the 7 victim summaries across the table. Eleanor Whitaker, Harold Bell, Ruth Calder, Miles Donnelly, Agnes Pike, Walter Sims, June Merrow. All over 70, most lived alone or in assisted housing. Most rarely used online banking, and every one of them had reported a late bank notice, a delayed insurance letter, a missing replacement card, or a torn envelope within the last month. The store was not the beginning. It was only the place where someone spent what had already been taken. I drew a line through the addresses, then another through the mail routes, and a small, cold pattern appeared north of town. At the center sat a rural mail annex, a reduced staff transfer point serving Maple Hollow and the lake villages beyond it. The brass clock ticked beside Rin's basket. His nose twitched once in sleep, and the trail moved from the cash register to the mail. The next morning, the map on my kitchen table looked less like Vermont and more like a nervous system. Red lines followed mail routes, blue circles marked the homes of the 7 elderly victims. Yellow notes carried times, store charges, missing letters, torn envelopes, and late notices. Between the coffee mug, the evidence sleeves, and Rin's tiny milk bottle, my table had become the strangest field office I had ever worked from. Rin slept in his basket near the brass clock, one paw resting on the edge of the wool as if he were trying to hold the whole world still. By then, I knew the case had moved beyond North Star Supply. The store was where someone used the stolen names. It was not where the names were first taken. That difference mattered. So I made the call I should have made the night before to the United States Postal Inspection Service. If the mail had been touched, delayed, opened, or used as a doorway into someone's private life, they belonged in the room. Inspector Marion Cole arrived just after 9, driving a dark blue sedan that looked as practical as a winter coat. She was 59, tall and narrow, with short silver hair cut close to her head, warm brown skin, steel-framed glasses, and a navy jacket that seemed to have no tolerance for nonsense. Her face was calm, but not soft. It was the face of a woman who had spent decades learning that envelopes could carry love letters, pension checks, birthday cards, and sometimes the first footprints of a thief. She shook my hand firmly, glanced at Rin, and raised one eyebrow. "I have worked mail fraud for 31 years, she said. "This is the first briefing I have attended with a witness who needs a bottle every 3 hours." "He is not a witness," I said. Rin hiccuped in his sleep. Marion looked at him again. "Then he is already smarter than half the witnesses I have interviewed." I liked her immediately. We started with the 7 victims. Marion listened while I laid out the pattern. Store card purchases, personal information used correctly, IDs that looked valid at a glance, and gift cards folded into otherwise ordinary transactions. She did not interrupt. She wrote in a small black notebook with handwriting so neat it looked printed. When I mentioned the delayed mail, her pen slowed. When I showed her photographs of Eleanor's resealed envelope and Harold's blue-gray ink smear, her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "This is not random porch theft," she said. "A person grabbing mail for quick cash takes checks, packages, maybe cards. This is selective. Financial envelopes, replacement cards, insurance notices, credit offers. They are building people piece by piece." That sentence stayed with me. Building people piece by piece. It sounded almost biblical, except there was no holy breath in it, only paperwork and greed. Marion drove me to the rural mail annex north of Maple Hollow. I did not bring Rin. He stayed with Eleanor, who had appeared at my door with a knitted cap for him that was far too large, and a face so determined I would have needed a court order to refuse her. The annex sat between a gravel road and a stand of dark pines, a low brick building with a faded flag, a loading bay, and old security cameras mounted under the eaves. It was not abandoned. That would have been too easy. It was worse than abandoned. It was underwatched. Reduced staff, old locks, long hours when one tired clerk and a humming vending machine guarded the private lives of 3 lake villages. The annex supervisor, Paul Reddick, met us at the side entrance. He was a thin man in his late 40s with sandy hair, a pale beard trimmed close to his jaw, and shoulders that sloped as if every missing letter in the county had been placed on them. He wore a postal fleece zipped to his throat and kept rubbing the back of his neck while he spoke. He was not rude. He was frightened of being responsible. A broken side lock had been reported twice. A temporary driver had complained about poor lighting. The night camera over the loading bay had a blind spot wide enough for a bad decision to walk through. In the small security room, we watched the footage. Gray dawn. Empty lot. Snowless summer pavement still damp from night fog. At 4:18 a.m., A white van rolled into view with its plates blurred by mud or intention. A figure stepped out wearing a delivery jacket and a cap pulled low. The person moved with calm purpose, not panic, not hurry. That was always the worst kind of wrong. The figure entered through the side door and came out 3 minutes later with a small canvas mail tub. Not a full bin, not random handfuls, selected mail. The old monitor gave a sudden electric pop, and the screen flashed white. In that brief glare, the figure on the footage turned toward the camera, just enough for the brim of the cap to hide the face and reveal the gloved hand holding 3 pale envelopes. The room went silent. Even the vending machine seemed to stop humming, as if the building itself had just realized what had been carried out through its side door. Marion rewound the clip twice. They knew what they wanted. "Bank mail," I said. "And anything that helps answer security questions," she added. "Insurance, benefits, statements, replacement cards. Enough scraps to sound like the person on the phone?" The investigation changed shape again. Whoever was behind this was not taking a whole identity from one place. They were harvesting fragments from many places. A date of birth from one form, a phone number from another, a card notice from the mail, a security answer from a friendly senior safety session. Then they stitched those fragments together until an elderly person became a usable mask. Back at my kitchen table, Rin was awake. Eleanor sat beside him, her orange cat Moses on the windowsill behind her, tail moving like a judge's finger. Moses was an elderly round-bellied cat with faded orange fur, one cloudy eye, and an expression that suggested all federal agencies were beneath him. Rin, unaware of this judgment, tried to crawl toward my FBI jacket and made it 3 determined inches before collapsing on his chin. Marion stared at the table. Maps, bottles, evidence sleeves, a heating pad, and a towel printed with tiny blue ducks. "Agent Ward," she said, "your command center has a nursery attached." "My nursery has a command center attached," I said. She almost smiled. Then we sorted the materials again. Marion brought delivery logs from the annex. I brought the victim timeline. A new name appeared near several forms: Lake Briar Senior Outreach. The organization helped older residents fill out benefit paperwork, arrange medical rides, hold mail during hospital stays, and attend fraud prevention workshops. It sounded almost saintly on paper, which made me trust it less. Not because goodness was false, but because false goodness always dressed carefully. That afternoon, we visited their office on Church Street. Lake Briar occupied the first floor of a renovated white building with flower boxes, polished windows, and a blue sign showing 2 hands holding a maple leaf. Inside, everything smelled of lemon cleaner and fresh copies. Volunteers moved quietly between desks. A wall displayed photographs of smiling seniors holding grocery bags, blankets, and thank you cards. Noah Vance came out to meet us before we asked for him. He was 46, handsome in a practiced way, with neatly combed brown hair, a trimmed beard, clear hazel eyes, and a charcoal vest over a pale shirt. He had the soft, steady voice of a man used to calming rooms. When he shook my hand, he held it just long enough to seem sincere, and not long enough to seem strange. He spoke about protecting the generation that built this country. He gave Marion access to public program schedules. He even offered coffee. A helpful man can be a blessing. A perfectly helpful man can be a fog. Noah explained that many seniors signed forms authorizing Lake Briar to help with mail holds during surgery, benefit renewals, and fraud prevention outreach. Nothing illegal about that, nothing suspicious by itself. But on a side table near the copier, I saw a stack of shipping labels. One had the same blue-gray smudge near its corner. Later, back at the kitchen table, I placed a loose Lake Briar label beside Eleanor's envelope and Harold's folded paper. Rin had been asleep. The moment the label touched the table, his nose wrinkled. He turned his head away from it and tucked his muzzle into the wool. He did not cry. He did not point. He only rejected the scent. That was enough to make me look harder. By evening, Marion traced several delayed letters to the same night shift at the rural annex. In the volunteer access records for mail holds and senior paperwork, one organization appeared again and again, Lake Briar Senior Outreach. And every authorization form had been signed by the same polished hand, Noah Vance. Maple Hollow began preparing for the Apple Harvest Festival as if the town had never known a secret in its life. Red ribbons appeared on lampposts. Wooden crates of early apples stood outside the grocer. The church lawn filled with folding tables, paper signs, and elderly volunteers who moved slowly but gave orders with the authority of generals. From the outside, it was all sunlight, cinnamon, and community pride. From where I stood, it felt like a bright quilt laid over a floorboard that had started to groan. I brought Rin only because the church hall was warm, quiet, and Eleanor had promised to hover over him like a grandmother angel with knitting needles. He slept in a soft carrier against my chest, wrapped in his blue cloth, his sable fur barely visible beneath the wool. At nearly 4 weeks old, he was still more wish than dog, all nose, paws, and tiny sighs. Every time the choir upstairs reached a high note, his muzzle wrinkled as if he personally objected to soprano ambition. I tried not to smile. FBI training had not prepared me for questioning witnesses while a puppy judged church music. The church kitchen smelled of butter, apples, coffee, and warm sugar. 3 women stood over cooling pies like judges at a county trial. Mrs. Gladys Pike, a round woman in her late 70s with white curls, pink cheeks, and a laugh that shook her shoulders, insisted a proper apple pie needed enough cinnamon to wake the ancestors. Beside her, Ruth Calder, one of the victims from my list, was 81, narrow as a broom handle, with soft gray hair, deep-set eyes, and a navy dress buttoned to the throat. Ruth believed too much cinnamon was culinary shouting. The third woman, Beatrice Lowell, a retired school secretary with copper-dyed hair and thin gold glasses, handed me a fork and said, "Agent Ward, you look trustworthy. Judge this." I chose the wrong pie. The room went silent for 1 holy second before Gladys patted my arm and said, "Do not worry, dear. That one lost last year, too." Even Marion Cole laughed, though she tried to hide it behind her coffee. She stood near the bulletin board in her navy jacket, silver hair neat, steel-framed glasses catching the kitchen light. Marion did not waste movement. Even in a church basement full of pie tins, she watched exits, hands, paper stacks, and anything left unattended. That was why I trusted her. She could smell a lie without needing Rin's nose. We were not there for pie. We were there because the paperwork had begun to speak. The rural mail annex footage showed the white van. Delivery logs placed delayed financial mail on the same night shifts. A Lake Briar shipping label had turned up near the annex. Several store card charges matched dates when North Star employees had been told to accept forgotten card verification with less pushback. And Dale Mercer, who had spent 2 days looking like a man slowly sinking in his own skin, had finally agreed to talk again. He met us in a small Sunday school room beside the church hall. Dale looked older than he had at North Star. His brown plaid shirt was clean but wrinkled, his thick mustache twitched when he swallowed, and his blue eyes had the raw shine of someone who had not slept. In the fluorescent light, the silver in his hair looked almost white. He held a paper cup of coffee with both hands and did not drink it. "I thought it would be one time," he said. "Most confessions begin that way, not with thunder, not with a villain's speech." Just one small door opened in fear. Dale told us his adult son, Evan, had worked part-time for Lake Briar the previous winter, helping carry donation boxes and drive seniors to appointments. Evan was 26, restless, and too proud to admit he was broke. Someone had used him to move gift cards, then kept proof. Dale would not say Noah Vance forced him directly. Not at first. He said only that Noah had made it clear a scandal would ruin Evan, and maybe Dale too. After that, Dale began training cashiers to trust the green approval screen, to keep lines moving, to avoid embarrassing older customers who forgot cards or IDs. It sounded harmless when wrapped in customer service language. That was the poison of it. "You knew," Marion said. Dale closed his eyes. "I suspected." "That is not the same thing," he whispered, as if asking the room to forgive the difference. "No," I said gently, but it was close enough to let people be harmed. He nodded once, and the nod seemed to break something in him. Then he gave us what we needed: dates, receipt batches, employee initials, and the name of a locked storage area Lake Briar rented beneath the church, officially for blankets, donated heaters, and festival supplies. His statement did not stand alone, but it joined the paper trail. Annex footage, delayed mail, suspicious charges, and Lake Briar access forms. Marion stepped outside to make the call. Within hours, she had the legal authority to inspect the storage area. Wren did not give us the warrant. The paper did. Still, before Marion returned, I walked through the lower hall with him asleep, against my chest. The old choir room sat at the end, unused except during festivals. Its door stood partly open. Inside were folding chairs, music stands, dusty hymnals, and an oak cabinet with brass handles darkened by age. As I passed it, Wren stirred. His little nose pushed out from the cloth. He made no dramatic sound, only a thin breath, then a turn of the head away from the cabinet. Warm plastic, bitter ink, paper that had been handled too carefully. I stopped. Wren made me look. The warrant came from the paper trail. From upstairs, the choir struck a bright note that rang down the stairwell like a bell, and at that exact second, Wren gave a tiny, wounded whimper against my chest. The cabinet door, touched by a draft, moved just enough to release a dry wooden creak. For a moment, the smell of apples vanished, and all I could sense was heated ink hiding beneath hymns. When Marion returned with authorization, Noah Vance arrived with her. He wore a charcoal vest, a pale blue shirt, and the wounded expression of a man who had already prepared himself to be misunderstood. His brown hair was perfectly combed. His trimmed beard framed a mouth that knew how to soften every sentence. "Of course," he said, hands open. "If something improper happened in space we rented, I want to know as much as you do." That was Noah's gift. He could make cooperation feel like innocence. The cabinet key was not where the church records said it should be. Marion had the lock open properly, with the pastor present. Reverend Samuel Price, a gentleman in his late 60s with dark skin, silver eyebrows, and a careful voice shaped by years of hospital visits and funerals, stood nearby with both hands folded over his stomach. His face grew sad before it grew surprised. He had trusted Lake Briar. Everyone had. Inside the cabinet were plastic storage bins labeled festival flyers, winter blankets, and choir programs. Beneath the flyers we found gift cards with the codes already scratched. Beneath the blankets, receipts from North Star Supply and 2 stores in neighboring towns. In a flat black folder were copied IDs, headshots of unfamiliar men, and printed personal details belonging to Eleanor, Ruth, Harold, and others. Some cards were unfinished, the photos and names not yet sealed beneath plastic. Then came the rehook made real. In one sleeve lay an ID template. The photograph showed a broad-faced man I had never seen, with heavy brows and a short beard. But the name printed beneath the photo was Harold Bell. Harold, who was upstairs near the fellowship hall, showing Ruth how his old pocket watch still kept perfect time. Noah drew in a breath. Not too sharp, not too late. A practiced breath. "I have no idea how that got there," he said. "We had a volunteer last month, a troubled man. I told him we could not keep him." Marion looked at him over her glasses. "We will need his name." "Of course," Noah said. He gave one. Maybe it was real, maybe it was another borrowed mask. By sundown, the church was buzzing with frightened whispers. Some people looked at Noah with doubt, Others looked at him with pity. That was the danger of a polished man. Even surrounded by shadows, he still reflected light. As Marion cataloged the bins, I found a thin ledger tucked inside a stack of festival donation forms. At first, it looked harmless. Names of volunteers, pie assignments, blanket drives, apple crates, cider jugs, blue ribbons, but certain words repeated beside the names from my victim list: apple, cider, blanket, clock, blue ribbon. I did not yet know the code, but I knew one thing. This was not a list of pies. By noon, Maple Hollow looked like a postcard that had learned how to pray. American flags moved gently above Main Street. Baskets of red and gold apples lined the sidewalks. Honey jars caught the sun like little lamps. Somewhere near the bandstand, a fiddle played a tune so cheerful it almost convinced me the world was simple. Elderly couples walked arm in arm between booths. Church ladies guarded pie tables, and volunteers in Lake Briar badges handed out brochures with smiles polished bright enough to reflect the sky. That was what troubled me most. Darkness is easy to recognize when it arrives, wearing a mask of cruelty. It is harder when it smells like cinnamon, speaks softly to widows, and offers free coffee beside a sign that says, "Senior Safety Check." Rind slept against my chest in his warmed carrier, his sable head tucked beneath the blue cloth Eleanor had brought that morning. He was almost 4 weeks old now, still too small for the wide world, but stronger than he had been when I first carried him out of the cold. His ears remained folded, his eyes were clearer, and his tiny black nose had become the most serious part of his body. At one booth, a retired carpenter with suspenders and hands like weathered oak leaned over and grinned at him. "Well now," the old man said, "that must be the smallest federal agent in America." Rin answered with a hiccup, which did not weaken the man's faith in him at all. I bought Rin a little blue collar from a craft table, though it was still far too large. The woman selling it, a cheerful grandmother with silver braids and apple-shaped earrings, told me he would grow into it. I held the collar in my hand and imagined him one day running over the green grass by the lake, strong and certain, no longer a trembling life tucked beneath my coat. That hope warmed me in a way I did not expect. Maybe that is how healing begins, not as a grand sunrise, but as the courage to buy something for a future you are still afraid to believe in. Marion Cole found me near the church tent, where the Apple Festival ledger lay open on a folding table behind a stack of donation forms. She had no pie in her hand, which proved again that she was stronger than I was. Her steel-framed glasses sat low on her nose, and her navy jacket looked severe among all the gingham and bunting. "I matched the words," she said. We stepped behind the fellowship booth, away from the music. Marion spread out copies of the ledger pages beside victim notes, store card activity, mail hold forms, and Lake Briar program schedules. At first the words looked harmless: apple, cider, blanket, clock, blue ribbon. They could have belonged to any festival in Vermont. But when Marion paired them with the victims, the sweetness soured. Apple meant clean credit. Cider meant likely to answer unknown phone calls. Blanket meant living alone. Clock meant slow to detect online banking changes. Blue ribbon meant ready for immediate use. Eleanor Whitaker had been marked blanket and apple. Ruth Calder had been marked cider. Harold Bell had been marked clock and blue ribbon. For a moment I could hear only the fiddle music drifting from the bandstand. It sounded too happy for the page in front of me. These were not people to Noah's organization. They were harvest notes, ripe, reachable, slow to notice, easy to carry away. Lake Briar had not taken everything at once. That would have frightened people. Instead, Noah's group had gathered fragments over time, each one wrapped in kindness. A credit safety workshop collected birth dates and phone numbers. A Medicare paperwork day gathered partial identification details. A hospital mail hold service gave access to incoming envelopes. A follow-up call, warm and official sounding, filled in what remained. One thread at a time, they had made a net. Across the lawn, Noah Vance stood beneath the Lake Briar banner in a pale shirt and charcoal vest, greeting seniors by name. His beard was trimmed, his smile gentle, his posture open. He bent toward Ruth Calder, as if every word she spoke mattered deeply. Then he turned, saw me watching, and lifted one hand in greeting. No fear, no hurry, no crack in the mask. "He knows we are looking," I said. Marion followed my gaze. "He believes looking is not the same as proving." Noah approached with 2 cups of lemonade, offering one to Marion and one to me. "Agent Ward," he said, his hazel eyes dropping briefly to Rin's carrier. "Your little survivor seems stronger every day. You have a gift for making fragile things feel safe." It was a beautiful sentence. That was the problem. In Noah's mouth, beauty felt measured. "Maple Hollow has taken good care of him," I said. "It is what good communities do." He looked toward the booths, the old couples, the church volunteers. "We protect our own." A wind moved through the flags above us. For one clean second, I wanted his words to be true. Then I remembered Eleanor's shaking hands, Harold's voice, and the ledger calling loneliness a category. Noah excused himself to greet a donor, and Marion leaned closer. "We still need the transfer point. The final batch has to move somehow." It was not happening in a dark alley or a locked room. That would have been too obvious. It was happening in public, hidden inside generosity. Lake Briar volunteers were handing out gift bags to seniors, brochures, pie coupons, safety checklists, apple butter samples, and small bakery boxes tied with twine. Too many hands, too many smiles, too many identical packages for a camera to separate cleanly. We began watching the bags. Harold Bell stood near the church booth, wearing his cream cardigan despite the warm afternoon. His white hair was neatly combed, and the silver chain of his pocket watch curved across his vest. He looked brighter than he had at Maple Haven, pleased to be useful, carrying bakery boxes from the church table to older visitors who could not stand in line. Helping others gave him dignity. That made what came next feel especially cruel. A burst of laughter rose near the pie table, bright as breaking glass, and Rin suddenly lifted his head from the blue cloth. His tiny nose trembled toward Harold, not toward the apples, not toward the cinnamon steam, toward one plain bakery box in Harold's hands. The fiddle kept playing, the flags kept moving, but in that small pause, the whole festival seemed to tilt around a puppy's breath. At first I thought Rin smelled butter. He was, after all, a baby with milk on his chin and no federal discipline. But he did not react when Gladys walked past with a full tray of pies. He did not stir when a boyish-looking volunteer carried 6 boxes at once. His nose followed only Harold's box. I touched Marion's sleeve. "The box?" She did not ask why. Good investigators know when a question can wait. Harold moved slowly across the lawn toward the Lake Briar tent, smiling whenever someone greeted him. I watched the box shift in his careful hands. The paper liner at the bottom looked slightly raised, not enough for most eyes, just a faint swelling beneath the twine-shadowed cardboard. My pulse changed, not faster exactly, colder. Noah stood near the senior safety check sign, speaking with Beatrice Lowell and a man in a blue volunteer vest. He did not look at Harold, which made me more certain he knew exactly where Harold was. Marion murmured into her radio, asking her team to cover the exits without drawing attention. I stepped into Harold's path gently, smiling as if I only wanted to check on him. "Mr. Bell," I said, "may I help carry that?" He smiled. "Oh, I have managed heavier burdens, Agent Ward." "I believe that," I said. "But this one may need to stop right here." His smile faded, not from fear of me, but from the terrible realization that his kindness might have been used. I hated that moment. I hated watching trust fold inward. Rin whimpered again, soft and certain. I looked down at the bakery box. The raised liner caught the light. Then I touched my radio. "Marion," I said quietly, keeping my eyes on the box and not on Noah. "Don't stop Noah yet. Stop the box." Harold Bell looked at me, then at the bakery box in his hands, and something quiet moved across his face. It was not fear at first. It was shame, the unfair kind that belongs not to the person who has done wrong, but to the person who realizes his kindness has been used as a tool. I hated seeing that in him. He was an 82-year-old man with a pocket watch, careful hands, and a heart still trained by habit to be useful. Men like Harold did not deserve to be turned into corridors for other people's lies. "Mr. Bell," I said softly, keeping my voice low so the music and laughter around us would cover the words. "You did nothing wrong, but I need Marion to look inside that box." He nodded once. His fingers tightened around the cardboard before he handed it over. Rin, tucked against my chest in his warm carrier, made one small sound and pressed his nose toward the box again. Not loud, not dramatic, just certain. Marion stepped beside me, calm as ever, her silver hair bright in the noon sun. She guided Harold behind the church tent where the pie table blocked most of the crowd's view. There, with Reverend Samuel Price standing nearby as a witness, Marion lifted the paper liner inside the box. Beneath it was a flat white envelope. Inside the envelope were three things: a gift card with the code already scratched, a slip of paper with a new phone number written in blue-gray ink, and a half-finished identification card bearing Harold's name, Harold's address, and the face of a stranger. The smell rose faintly even before I touched it. Warm plastic, bitter ink, paper handled too carefully. Rin turned his head away from the scent and tucked his muzzle into my coat. Harold stared at the card. His face did not break. It simply emptied, as if someone had opened a window in winter. "That is my name," he whispered. "But that is not me." "No," I said. "It is not." Across the lawn, Noah Vance was still smiling beneath the Lake Briar banner. He stood beside the senior safety check table, one hand resting on a stack of brochures, his trimmed beard neat, his charcoal vest smooth, his posture open and saintly. He did not glance toward us. That was how I knew he understood exactly where the box had gone. A man who looks too little at danger is often listening to it with his whole body. Marion moved fast, but not loudly. She radioed her team near the exits, then contacted North Star Supply's Briar Falls branch across the lake. Dale Mercer's chance to do one right thing had arrived, and to his credit, he took it. His voice came through Marion's speaker a few minutes later, rough and strained. He had called the Briar Falls manager himself and warned them to delay any forgotten store card transaction under Harold Bell's name. He told them to ask for extra verification, check the ID slowly, and keep the person at the counter. Dale was not washed clean by that call. Silence had carried him too far for that. But sometimes redemption begins as a small hand placed against a closing door. At 1:17 p.m., a man entered the Briar Falls North Star branch and tried to purchase tool batteries, a compact generator, and several gift cards under Harold Bell's account. The branch manager, Tina Alvarez, was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled into a tight braid, olive skin, and the steady expression of someone who had raised 3 teenagers and feared no impatient customer. She followed Dale's instructions and asked for additional verification. The man showed an ID with Harold's information and his own photograph. He was in his 30s, broad-faced, with heavy brows, a trimmed dark beard, and the restless jaw of a man already planning his way out. Tina kept him talking long enough for local officers and Marion's contacts to arrive. Marion's radio crackled so sharply it cut through the fiddle music like a snapped wire. "Briar Falls has him," a voice said. The church bells rang once above us at the same moment, deep and bright, and Harold closed his eyes as if that single note had reached into the place where fear had been sitting. The man at Briar Falls carried a phone with messages that did not say Noah's name. Men like Noah rarely leave their names where truth can find them. But the messages used the same language as the ledger. Blue ribbon ready. Clock confirmed. Box moved. One outgoing instruction came from a device registered to a Lake Briar outreach program. Not enough, alone, to tell the whole story. Enough with the envelope, the ledger, the false ID, the annex footage, Dale's statement, and the store transaction to make the mask begin to slip. Noah finally moved when he saw Marion walking toward him with 2 uniformed officers. He did not run. Running would have admitted too much to the crowd that still believed in him. Instead, he stepped away from the booth and walked toward the wooden footbridge that crossed a narrow stream before the lake. I followed, Rin still against my chest, while the festival behind us began to quiet in ripples. Noah stopped halfway across the bridge. Sunlight lay on the water below, and maple leaves trembled above us like small green hands. He turned to me with sadness arranged carefully on his face. "You misunderstand what we were trying to do," he said. "Older people need help managing complicated systems. Bills, cards, mail. They get confused." "No," I said. "You counted on them being trusting." His jaw tightened, just a fraction. "We provided services. You collected pieces of their lives until you could wear their names." The wind moved across the lake. For the first time, Noah had no beautiful sentence ready. Marion came up behind him and spoke with the calm weight of law. Noah was taken from the bridge without spectacle. No shouting, no grand collapse, no thunder. Just a man in a clean vest walking away while the people he had fooled watched the light change around him. In the weeks that followed, Lake Briar was closed for investigation. Accounts were frozen, cards canceled, credit files corrected, and more victims were found in neighboring towns. Dale Mercer gave a full statement and helped identify transactions his store should have stopped. He had much to answer for, but he also helped return several names before they could be used again. Eleanor received a new account and a fraud alert. Ruth Calder changed her phone habits. Harold kept his pocket watch close. Before I left Maple Hollow, Harold gave me the old leather strap from that watch. "For Rin's basket," he said, "so the little fellow remembers time belongs to honest things." Eleanor gave Rin a new wool blanket, softer than the first, blue as a clear morning. Marion mailed me a small card later, written in her neat hand, "For the youngest nose in federal history." When Noah was taken away, Harold opened his pocket watch one last time in the festival light. Inside, the paper with the old bank number had been replaced by a new note, written in his own careful hand. "My name is still mine." I looked at those words, then at Rin asleep in his carrier, his tiny paw resting against the blue cloth. He was not my partner yet. He was not trained, certified, or even steady on his paws. But he had turned toward what others tried to hide. He had heard the quiet ache behind paper and ink. 2 weeks later, a white envelope arrived at my office. Inside was a photograph from Maple Hollow, Rin asleep beside Harold's pocket watch, Eleanor's blanket tucked around him, the little blue collar still too large at his side. I taped the photograph inside the back cover of the file. Then I wrote the final line. Rin was not my partner yet. But sometimes instinct arrives before a badge. At the end of this story, perhaps the lesson is simple, but not small. A person's name is more than letters on a document. It carries a lifetime of work, love, sacrifice, family, memory, and dignity. When someone is old, quiet, or living alone, that does not mean their life has become less valuable. Sometimes the people who speak the softest are the ones who have carried the heaviest years. Rin was only a tiny puppy in this file. He could not run after danger. He could not wear a badge. He could not understand bank accounts, false papers, or stolen names. But he could sense what others missed. He turned toward the hidden pain. He reminded Jessica that even the smallest life, when guided by love, can help bring truth into the light. That is something we can carry into our own daily lives. We do not have to be heroes in a grand way. We can check on an elderly neighbor. We can be patient with someone who moves slowly. We can protect those who are too trusting. We can listen when someone says, "Something does not feel right." And we can be kind to animals, because sometimes God sends comfort through the gentlest creatures, a loyal dog, a quiet cat, a small paw resting beside a lonely hand. Maybe that is the miracle in this story. Not thunder from the sky, not a golden light breaking through the clouds, but a little puppy surviving the dark and then helping others find their way out of it. God's grace often moves like that, quietly, tenderly, through the ones the world almost overlooked. So may we live with softer hearts and sharper eyes. May we protect the elderly, honor the forgotten, and care for the animals who love us without asking for anything grand in return. May we remember that kindness is never wasted, and that love, even when it begins small, can become a lantern for someone else. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who still believes in goodness. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or share a story about an animal who changed your life. And if you want more emotional stories of justice, loyalty, and hope, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, your family, your home, and every gentle creature who walks beside you.